Hi, welcome back to Drunken Medicine, where we are drunk on medicine and passionate about whiskey. I am Dr. May. I'm a naturopathic physician, board certified in endocrinology, and been practicing for about 13 plus years. And yeah, Mike, introduce yourself.
So I have also been practicing for just about the same amount of time. My name is Mike. I'm an acupuncturist, um, licensed and certified, since we're talking about certifications. And if you want to know more about us, you can look at the first episode and we talk all about our past and who we are. So
Yeah,
you should be tuning in and check out those other episodes. But I am glad to be here.
certifiable. All right.
It's true.
So we are going to talk about some medicine today, particularly long COVID. But before we jump into that, Mike, what are you drinking?
Ooh, this is something special. So this is a 2011 cask strength Jura, bottle number 317. It's an 11-year cask strength,
Ooh,
single barrel, excellent.
nice.
59.2. So I did add water, 59.2%. So it's almost
Yeah.
120 proof.
Wow. Dang. Yeah. You better add some water on that one.
This is nice because this is a scotch for the person who may not like scotch. Like it's like a sweet bourbon almost. It has that kind
Oh,
of sweet
yeah.
aged fruits and like a little bit earthy, but there's no smoke, there's no peat, there's nothing like that's going to
Yeah.
offend the sensitive taste buds from people such as yourself. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
For people who aren't used to scotch, really.
Yeah. Well, I like that. As long as it's a little sweeter, I tend to like those kind of scotches.
And it's not gross
Yeah.
sweet. It's like a nice, pleasant sweet. So
Right. Well, you need something to kind of balance out that peatiness that usually comes with scotch.
but
Cool.
yes, reminds me of a good bourbon, is what it reminds me of, but not very oaky, like without a lot of
Yeah.
the oak bite.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How
Cool.
about you? What are you drinking?
Well, I just had my glass today. It brought in just a flask, so I don't have the bottle with me. But it's really cool. We actually went. This distillery close by in Big Fork, Montana, was releasing a new product this weekend, and the distiller is called Whistling Andy Distilling in Big Fork, Montana. But this it's called Bottled in Bond. It's been aged 5 years. It's made from like corn, like just from Montana, and it's really nice. Like it's pretty strong. It's 100 proof,
Oh wow.
um, but it's really well balanced, man. It's like I really enjoy just drinking it neat. No, didn't even have to put any water or anything into it or ice. Just neat, and it was spectacular. So that's what I'm having a little bit of today.
And I like this bottled in bond. Did you know that bottled in bond originally came out because back in the day they were questionable about what kind of whiskey you were getting, and
Yep.
so they came up with bottled in bond where it has to be at least 100 proof. It has to be exactly 100 proof and aged for at least 4 years to be called bottled in bond. So
Yep, that was the Bottle and Bond Act of 1894 or something like that, if I
yeah, which
remember
is
right.
awesome because
Yeah.
before that you didn't know what you were getting. You were just assuming the person wasn't poisoning you. You weren't going to go blind.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say you weren't going to go blind. Yeah. Yeah. Pretty cool stuff. But yeah, I've
Methanol is
really
not
enjoyed
what
it.
you want
It's
when you're
yeah,
drinking.
you don't. So I've really enjoyed this one. This one's a good one.
Nice. I want to try it.
Yeah.
You can't
Yeah.
send me any
Definitely.
because that's highly illegal, but I'd love to try it.
Well, you just have to come visit.
I know I do. We need to do a Montana podcast.
That's a great idea.
I know. We could do like the week of Montana.
There you go. All right, man. So we are talking about long COVID today.
This is a big one, man. This is something that is not being talked about enough right now because there's
Yeah.
so many freaking people who have long COVID and either don't know it or they aren't being treated very well.
Yeah, that's what I found too. Like the treatment. I mean, it's becoming more accepted now, but even a year ago, I had several patients come to me saying like, "Yeah, I think I had this long COVID thing, or I've still had these symptoms after having COVID. My doctor thinks I'm just crazy and wants to put me on an antidepressant or something like that." But now it's becoming more accepted. Actually, there was just a article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So this is their main sort of flagship journal for the conventional medical system. And they actually had an article in there about long COVID and how to define it,
Oh
because
wow.
that's the other kind of issue is, how do we exactly define it? It's mostly just a constellation of different symptoms, but there have been over 200 documented symptoms of or potential symptoms of long COVID. So what this article did was they sort of narrowed it down and gave these symptoms a sort of a numbered system. So like if you had the loss of smell and taste, I think they gave that like 7 or 8 points. If you have what's called post-exertional malaise or sort of fatigue, they gave that 7 or 8 points. If you hit 12 points or more, then you were considered like diagnostic for long COVID.
Oh
Um,
wow.
but again, it's just one of those things where we're trying to classify this as best as possible, but there's still a lot to it that we don't know, we don't understand, and so it's hard to be exact about diagnostics.
It's true. Sorry about my cat for everybody on YouTube. This is my cat. So no, it's true. It's absolutely true. It's like one of those things that the problem is it's so new. Like we've had plenty of epidemics in the past, and I'll talk a little bit later that Chinese medicine actually has a lot about, different epidemics that have happened and the way to classify it. So you can kind of fit into that, but it's still different because it's not something we've dealt with personally for this particular virus.
Right. Yeah. And some people, they had COVID and they weren't very symptomatic, like it was just like a mild flu. But then, 6 months later, they're still struggling with pain or fatigue or whatever else it might be. So
Yeah,
it
it's
that
true.
that part gets a little tough because a lot of this is subjective, and so you just kind of have to go by what the patient tells you. And you have one person come in who, they have different pain tolerances, they have other things going on with their bodies. Like it gets kind of hard to pinpoint,
It
what's
does.
going on there.
But I mean, with any latent virus that can still affect you, it's kind of the same thing if you think about it. I mean, Epstein-Barr for a long time, doctors didn't really know what to do with that, and some still don't. And we've known
Hmm.
about that for a long time. And then 1,000 years ago, it was syphilis. It just like show up many years later, and like, what do we do with this thing? Like, we
Yep.
don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's tricky.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I'll talk a little bit about the history of it from the Chinese medicine perspective. It's actually quite
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah.
So, as of 2,000 years ago, they were talking about epidemics and how something that doesn't immediately kill you can still affect you years down the road. So, they were talking about that about 2,000 years ago.
Wow.
1,300 years ago, they came up with a name for it called GU syndrome, GU syndrome.
Hmm.
And the idea behind it was it started with parasites, but the doctors who talked about it said, well, this isn't just parasites. It's just parasites is the best thing we have right now at this current time. And it's like something doesn't kill you, and that's good. You're happy. But then you have all these lingering symptoms that just keep going and going. And they compared it to like something burrowing into your body systems and then just hanging out there, a bird making a nest in a tree and just like staying, and you can't get it out.
Wow.
Um,
That's actually a pretty good description.
It is. And they talked about the main symptoms that you would see with it. And this was 2,000 years ago: fatigue, muscle pain, anxiety, depression. Like these are the things they were talking about 1,700 years ago.
Hmm.
And people with certain comorbidities or a less healthy body being at higher risk for it.
Hmm.
So it's just kind of cool that they were talking about this, over
Hmm.
1,000 years ago. And they're looking, years later and saying, okay, this affects you. And they were saying that some of these can even still kill you or reduce your lifespan over
Hmm.
time because it's
Hmm.
still sitting there taxing your body, taxing your immune system constantly. So,
Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating. Huh.
so yeah, they knew that this stuff was happening because they had multiple plagues. It wasn't just parasites. Like they dealt with plagues. Like I feel like we're on such a small time frame in our lives that it's really easy to forget the past of like, oh yeah,
Mhm.
COVID is really bad, but it's not the bubonic plague, which is good because many generations lived through that as it kept popping back up again and again. And they'd get the Black Plague, and then 60% of their city would die, and then it would go away again. And so it's easy to forget. Like, yes, it sucks if you're going through it, but over human history, we've seen a lot of different things that can linger and go on. So,
wow, that's really fascinating. I mean, we talk about this each week. It's like just the Chinese have done such a good job of just being observant, right? It's like I think we've lost a lot of that in sort of modern medicine because we're so dependent upon lab tests, and imaging to tell us what's going on. We've lost some of that observation and like physical exams.
yeah,
A lot of docs don't do physical exams anymore because they're dependent mostly on imaging and blood tests. So that's great.
Yep.
I hope we make that shift again.
And there was a doctor in the 1600s. This is so kind of awesome. It's like this doctor treated 3 different waves of plague, like a major plague in the 1600s. He didn't die, and then he watched everybody, and the people who survived would have these lurking symptoms. So he would call it lurking pathogens because they would sit and they would wait. And so, this is the kind of thing that has happened before. And can you imagine how awesome this dude is? Like, no N95s or anything. He's just like, I'm just going to treat all this plague. I'm fine. Whatever.
Yeah. That's crazy. Wow.
So what about the Western perspective? Like what is going on with long COVID? Because a lot of people it's not talked about. My patients don't know.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. At this point, there's really like a few different hypotheses on what are going on. One of them is that, after COVID, there's still some persistent virus or remnants of it that are still causing some chronic inflammation and sort of ongoing symptoms. So that's kind of one theory. Another one is there are some immune cells like your B and T cells. They get triggered during this infection, and then eventually, like afterwards, they can cause a sort of type of autoimmunity, type of reaction. And I definitely see like there are certain genotypes or people who have like certain gene variations that are more likely to have that happen. And that's not new for COVID. Like we can see oftentimes these people who have these genetic variations, it just takes some type of trauma to sort of create that trigger. And whether that trauma is an infection, like a virus or bacterial infection, or I've seen it after a significant like motor vehicle accident or some other sort of physical trauma, concussions, traumatic brain injuries, things like that can be that trigger. So that's another hypothesis. Another one is just like there are some latent viruses that are in there, like you're talking about, like Epstein-Barr. So if someone has a latent virus, we call them sort of stealth viruses. So this would be like your Epstein-Barr virus that causes mono or cytomegalovirus or human herpes 6. There are a few different ones, and that gets sort of reactivated, and that can cause its own sort of subset of symptoms. And then one other sort of hypothesis or theory is that this initial infection creates some long-term inflammatory changes. And the best way I can kind of describe that is like when you're in pain, especially when you're in chronic pain, eventually your brain can do something called centralization, where it just becomes more sensitized to the effects of pain. So it's like you sense pain at a much greater level than you would, previously, because of how your brain senses pain. So it's kind of this sort of self-perpetuating issue. And I feel like that's kind of what this is, this theory is kind of creating or talking about is like once that inflammatory process has happened, it gets changed a bit. And now you start, creating inflammation in a greater, more non-specific way than you would have previously. So anyway, those are sort of the 4 main theories at this point. And I've seen a lot of these play out. So that's the tricky thing is, it's like fibromyalgia. You could have 10 people with fibromyalgia and they could have 10 different causes and 10 different subsets of sort of, symptoms to some extent. So that's what makes long COVID tricky is, You can have 10 different people with long COVID, and they can present vastly different for vastly different reasons. And so that makes it really tricky to treat.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's somewhere
yeah.
that I think Chinese medicine excels, by the way, is because we don't treat any particular disease. We treat patterns, like observable patterns in people. So even
Mhm.
if you know it's this GU syndrome, you're still going to treat every patient different because it's based on whatever pattern they're showing. So whatever, when I say pattern, I mean pattern of symptoms. Like whatever pattern of symptoms are showing, you design your
Mhm.
whole treatment plan around those symptoms. It doesn't even matter what's causing the underlying. Like you could just throw it out and it doesn't matter
Mhm.
because that's not how it's treated.
Interesting. So I'm curious, given the people that you've seen thus far with long COVID or what you suspect is long COVID, what have been some of the strategies that you've used so far?
Just throw everything, 100 needles. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, I mean, really, it's, a lot of the stuff I see is in Chinese medicine, it'd be deficiency symptoms of like, you have a lot of fatigue, you have these muscle aches, you may have some low grade, feeling flushed or feeling cold. It's like these different symptoms that are usually what's considered deficiency. So not doing too much is the biggest thing of like not putting in needles all over the place and exhausting their body that's already being taxed.
Mhm.
Using, minimal amount of needles to be able to do the maximum amount of work, basically.
Mhm.
The energy increasing points I'll do a lot, and moving energy and basically just really gentle techniques so that people continue to feel better. And people have noticed a significant difference. I've had somebody who had complained to their doctor forever, and their doctor was just like, I have nothing I can do. Like, leave me alone. Like, maybe I'll give you
Mhm.
some sleep medicine if you need it, whatever.
Mhm.
And they were able to stop going and pestering that doctor because they just felt so much better with the acupuncture. And something you
Mhm.
said, by the way, touched on it, I think, because one of the main theories, modern theories of how acupuncture works, because everybody knows the older theories about nerves and other things. One of the main modern theories is it actually changes how the brain perceives pain. So
Mhm.
acupuncture may not be solving your pain problem, but it's
Mhm.
actually modulating how the brain perceives and relays that pain. So your
Mhm.
formerly 7 pain, your brain now recognizes as a 3. Does it really
Yep.
matter if it's actually a 3? Like, no,
Yeah.
it matters
Yeah.
what you're experiencing, which is a 3 instead of
Right.
a 7.
Right. That's your reality. That's your brain's creating that reality, right? Whether
Yeah.
it's truly real or not, that's what your brain is detecting and trying to relay. So I'm totally with you here because I think this is where I've seen, like, personally and just professionally, where acupuncture has sort of shown the best is fibromyalgia and these chronic sort of
Yep.
pain syndromes where
Yep.
people are walking around daily with a pain level of like 8 to 10. And then acupuncture, although it takes, several weeks to do, it drops that daily pain level down to, a 3 to 5, which for someone who's in chronic pain, that's a game changer. I mean,
Yeah.
that's huge,
They
right?
can function again. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, very
I
cool.
agree. I think it's along those same lines, though. It's like, I think it's more than just decreasing inflammation, some of the other stuff I've talked about on the show. I
Mhm.
think there's actually, and there's some scientific research that we'll go into another study, like another show about, but that you're actually changing the perception of pain. And I mean, that's why cognitive behavioral therapy and some of the other things that you refer chronic pain patients to work is
Yep.
because it's processed through your brain. So whatever the injury is, it's still
Mhm.
always processed through your brain. And
Yep.
so if you can change how the brain perceives it, you're going to change everything.
Mhm. Yeah, I totally agree. Just changing. I love CBT in the way that they reframe certain things, whether it's pain, or other issues that people are having. So yeah, I completely agree with that.
And you're talking about latent virus. One more thing. I actually had this happen with a flu. I was in the best health of my life. And then 4 years ago, I got the worst flu I've ever had. I mean, like, knock you down, thought you were dying, weeks and weeks, doesn't end.
Mhm.
And I hear this from people with long COVID. I bet you've heard it too of like, I was fine, I was doing well. And then this virus hit me. And after that, I've never been the same. That's what happened to me
Mhm.
with this flu, the
Mhm.
exact thing that happened with me. And I think there's something to that. So if you're listening and that's what you felt is like, I haven't been diagnosed with anything, but I got COVID and then afterwards nothing's been the same, then you probably
Mhm.
have long COVID, even though you haven't been diagnosed or anything else. It's probably it.
Yeah, And we've seen this pop up with other viruses, like you said, with this flu. I've seen this happen where people, we sort of diagnose them with chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia after like an infection like that happens, and they're just never the same quite like after that. So this has been around for a while. It's just, with COVID and all the sort of press and sort of effort that we put into it because it was an epidemic or a pandemic. And so we've just put more effort into tracking it and what happens afterwards and that sort of thing. So I guess the sort of silver lining is it has kind of created a spotlight on this sort of post infectious sort of condition that can occur and maybe gives us some better strategies to treat it too.
Yeah, it's true. And you mind if I rock the boat a little bit? I'm not going to get us banned from YouTube or Spotify.
Oh boy, here we go. Rock away.
I don't care. I know this is going to come across and piss some people off. I don't care what you think about shots or anything else. If you're in support, if you're not in support, it's completely irrelevant to this conversation. So if you're waiting for us to get into that, I'm actually don't plan on talking about that at all because I think it's irrelevant to the conversation at hand of like post-COVID. So, at some point, maybe if we want to get kicked off the internet, we can have that discussion. But for now, I think like if you're listening, you're like, they haven't talked about like the most controversial subject. It's like, it's irrelevant to the patient experience, in my opinion. So
yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's to some extent, I mean, we know like obviously like there are people who get vaccinated that develop long COVID. I mean, I've seen people who have had COVID, and especially guys, because I tend to see a lot of men, sperm counts drop to zero. And we've seen the same thing with post-vaccine. But I tell you, like there's a difference in their sort of the relative risk there of like that happens much more frequently and to a higher extent if you actually had the disease versus the vaccine reaction. But again, we won't go into that.
But honestly, it's like when somebody comes to me and they're like, could this have been caused? Like, I mean, yes, anything can cause anything. But really, it's like, are you experiencing these symptoms of long COVID? Yes, let's work on that. So I guess I'm pragmatic when it comes to stuff like that. And it's like, whatever you choose to do, listener, you choose to do it. This is like, you are free. You choose to do what you do, and we're going to help you however we can. So,
yep. Yeah. I tell this to every patient that I see is like, hey, I'm not going to tell you what to do and what not to do. I'm going to give you information and what I've seen from experience and what I see in literature. And then so that you have the most, rounded information that you could have so that you can make the best decision for yourself. And that's the best I can do for you.
Yeah. So I hope you don't mind, but I just wanted to put that in before we go into treatment stuff, because I'm sure some listeners are wondering if we were going to talk about it, why hasn't it come up? Because that's usually what you hear about with all this, which I think is actually distracting from figuring out how to help people who are going through it, honestly. But
yeah, I mean, to some extent, although, we've gotten to a point where, especially with this, because of how politicized and all that it is, that we tend to refrain from talking about it because we don't, it's like in that category of religion and politics that we just try to avoid because we don't want to, create an argument there. But we've got to figure this out. Yeah, it's like, we've talked about this before. This is not going to be our last pandemic, likely in our lifetime,
Yeah.
So we have to figure out a way to disseminate correct information the right way and create more confidence in that information. Because now it's just like, you can throw statistics out to people and they're just like, oh, those statistics are made up, or I don't believe in those because they were from the government or this or that or whatever it might be, right? So even with sort of what we call facts, people still don't believe those. And for some of that, there's good reason to not believe in those numbers. So it's just, but it creates a really problematic sort of issue, especially moving forward for that next pandemic that we have to deal with.
And my undergrad is in experimental psychology, so I know a lot about statistics, and I kind of know how to parcel out what's a good study versus what's not. Average person probably doesn't as much. You just see it on TV and you're like, oh, well, that must be good. It says research, but if you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And listeners, if you want us to have a whole episode where we just discuss vaccines or whatever, I'd be fine with that as long as we kept it to a point that we got to still be online. But beyond that, like, this is not this particular discussion, I think. So
Yeah, I'm with you there.
so what do you
All
do?
right.
Somebody comes in, you've decided, okay, like you're showing enough symptoms that we can say, yes, you probably have long COVID. Like, how do you help them? What do you do?
Yeah. So it really depends on which symptoms they have. So the most common symptom is fatigue. I think somewhere around 60% of people who experience, long COVID are experiencing some form of fatigue or what's called post-exertional malaise. So, which is just basically you try to get up and do much of anything, it just really fatigues you. If you try to go exercise or be active, it really fatigues you. So that's what I most commonly see. And in order to treat that, we have to get really down to the crux of it. So you look at first obstacles. So what are some obstacles that might be in the way of being able to generate energy in the body? And one of the big obstacles is inflammation. So we do see people with chronic high levels of inflammation. If that's the case, whether it's from their immune system being sort of jacked up at that point, then that's what we're gonna push for, is reducing that inflammation.
Yeah.
Some people that I feel like there's a mass hit on their mitochondrial function, and this is where energy is made at its most basic level. So your mitochondria are the sort of powerhouse of the cell. It's the factory inside the cell that actually makes ATP, which is the currency of energy in the cell. So that's what actually drives metabolism and energy production inside the cell. And so I try to support them at that level. And
Yeah.
so there are several nutrients that are really good for that. This goes back to actually a book I read years and years ago. It was called Metabolic Cardiology by Steven Sinatra. He's since passed away, but this was a really fascinating story of he was a cardiologist in the East Coast, like in Boston area, I believe, and he had a pretty high rate of complications from surgery, from his heart surgery patients, and so he's
Mhm.
trying to figure out, like, how do I help these patients? And so he teamed up with, I believe it was a biochemist at the time, and figured out that there were certain nutrients that those heart cells needed
Hmm.
to
Interesting.
be able to repair and recover. And they were mostly CoQ10, D-ribose, which is a type of sugar, and L-carnitine, which actually helps to shuttle fatty acids inside the cell. And so he started giving these nutrients to his patients, before and after surgery. And he went from having one of the higher complication rates to by far one of the lowest complication rates. And these patients
Ooh.
recovered very, very well. So this kind of blew up as far as the sort of cardiology realm goes. But then we started being able to apply this to other things, like using it in chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, and seeing patients actually get better because we're adjusting or making some impact at that cellular level inside the cells, of like actually generating more money, more ATP, so
Yeah.
that people can actually produce energy. And so that's a really basic level that or a place that I typically start with people, and then just kind of going from there. As long as we can calm down any chronic inflammation and then start getting their mitochondria to start producing energy better, people tend to get better and they start moving that needle. And once that happens, then we can start building momentum, right? Adding more things in. I mean, obviously, there's other things like vitamin D and quercetin and zinc, and I use a lot of turmeric or curcumin as an anti-inflammatory. But those are great places to start, in my opinion, for fatigue anyway.
It's amazing at how similar what you and I do are, even though they're different. Every week we talk, I get amazed more and more because one of
Yeah.
the, we're talking about theories of how it works, and mitochondria. I talk about the kidney all the time, and that's actually one of the ongoing theories, is that like the reason that kidney is so big in any chronic illness is because it deals with like how mitochondria are working and like the energy
Mhm.
and the powerhouse that is not doing what it should. So one of the big theories is that when you're treating kidney stuff, you're also treating, like, boosting mitochondrial output basically. And
Hmm.
so anyways, I just found that interesting that you mentioned that, because it's like it's kind of one of the many theories of why what I do works, along
Yeah.
with anti-inflammatory, which we have scientific research to show that acupuncture is significantly beneficial with reducing inflammation, both
Yeah.
locally and generally. So,
Yep. Yeah. I've actually seen this happen recently. There's a test I often do called the Dutch test. It's a comprehensive hormone panel, but it includes some organic acids in there, one of which is called quinolinate, which looks at it's a marker of sort of nerve inflammation. And I've actually seen people who have done acupuncture and seen that marker go down, with their acupuncture treatments, which has been really fascinating to see.
yeah, it's just I don't know. I just think it's interesting. So, so yeah, a lot of the treatment stuff that I'm going to do is going to be along the same lines as far as the acupuncture goes. I mentioned
Mm,
you're not using too many needles. I'm going to treat the kidneys. You could have guessed that if I had asked, because you're a good student.
mm. That's right.
But yeah, I'm going to treat the kidneys, and then there's good gentle Chinese herbs that I could use. But honestly,
Mhm,
like I love the Chinese herbs, by the way, they work great. And I also like Western supplements. If I have a good naturopath I can refer to, it's like you know
mhm,
I like that. Also, the Chinese herbs are good, but it's not something that you can really reliably order online because there's so many garbage companies out there that make garbage product. And so I feel like
yeah,
maybe you do this also with your supplements, but it's like you want to go to a trusted source. So if you're
mhm.
listening to us and you heard Dr. May talk about how like turmeric, curcumin, like all these things are great, like you also want to make sure you're going to a trusted source because there's so much garbage out there that
Yep,
just is not going to help you or maybe even hurt you.
yep, absolutely. And we've seen that with Consumer Reports, where they look at, several companies or products and often find like what they say is in the product is actually not in there. And sometimes they're contaminated, with heavy metals and other contaminants because of poor manufacturing processes. And the other thing with nutrient therapy, it's like anything else. It's like any drug or medication. It's all about the dose and the form, right? And so it's like if you're not getting, if a product just has a bunch of herbs in it, and you see like, oh, these are great herbs, but they have a tenth of the dose that you need to actually you create the response that you're looking for, it's not going to work. So you need the right dose, and oftentimes you need the right form too. Magnesium is a great example of this. If you're looking just to keep your bowels moving, then using a magnesium citrate or oxide works just fine. But if you're actually wanting to use magnesium to help your anxiety or your sleep, you need a specific form of magnesium. And you need
Hmm.
a glycinate form or you need the L-threonate form. Especially the L-threonate, it's the only form that actually crosses the blood-brain barrier and gets into your brain. So it's like if you really want to calm your brain down, you're going to need that form of magnesium. So it kind of just goes back to you need good quality, you need the right dose, and you need the right form. And if a product doesn't have all three of those, you're just chasing your tail.
It's so true. I mean, I've bought a million kinds of magnesium, not a million. I like to exaggerate, but plenty. And and there's some that are amazing. Like the product that Apex carries is terrific, terrific
Mm-hmm.
because it's like a good form for what it treats. So if
Mm-hmm.
anybody needs magnesium, Apex, awesome. But outside of that, like if you just go and get the $7 bottle of super packed capsule, like
Mm-hmm.
caplets at the store, it may not do what you think it's doing.
Yep. 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 I agree. Well, before I forget, I want to just kind of throw this one out here too, just because it's a pretty fascinating one. This kind of became popular a few months ago. Um, is the use of nicotine to help with
Huh.
energy for post COVID. So, and this is really fascinating.
That's
There's actually a
interesting.
really great reason for it because that spike protein from COVID tends to dock onto the ACE receptor, and those ACE2 receptors especially are a lot in the lungs, and that's why you get all that lung damage with the chronic infection or the acute infection aspect of it. But these spike proteins can also attach to acetylcholine receptors, and so what they're finding is and some people, nicotine can actually displace that spike protein from that acetylcholine receptor. And acetylcholine is what you need for energy production as well. Most of your neurotransmitters is used. Most of those receptors are acetylcholine receptors. So anyway, that's part of sort of the fatigue aspect and maybe the depression that can come along with, and even some of the pain, the chronic pain, can be due to this, acetylcholine receptor, issue with the spike protein. So anyway, I thought that was pretty fascinating. I've actually seen this play out pretty cool, where I have a patient, start with a low dose nicotine patch, and they only use it for, they'll do one patch a day for about 7 days, just so a week or so. And sometimes that's enough to kind of get the ball rolling. And then we use all these other things as well. So anyway, I thought that was a fascinating one that I haven't always heard be discussed. Now, granted, we're not telling you to go out and grab a bunch of nicotine patches.
I was actually going to ask you if you're saying smoke up, doc.
Yeah, no.
Get a carton of Pall Malls right now is what Dr. May is saying.
Yeah. Let's not create a bunch of smoking addictions just to get over your long haul COVID. But yeah. Anyway, definitely should still be discussed with your physician.
I agree.
And figure out if that's something that would actually work for you. But I've seen, go ahead.
People don't realize that tobacco actually does have healing qualities. It's just that it's been so abused, and there's problems with it where we don't talk about it. But there's a lot of uses for tobacco that help with various different problems, and we just don't talk about it because we always assume or are worried that it's going to turn into somebody dying of lung cancer, which it could. So we don't talk about it as much. But.
Well, I mean, it's like alcohol. It's like marijuana. It's like those endocannabinoids that they can be useful for a lot of things, but if we overdo it, it's like anything else. It can be detrimental.
Yeah. It's true. But I'm glad you brought it up because, I remember when I was a kid and got a bee sting, my grandpa put his chewing tobacco on it. It would help a ton. And it's not something you'd ever think about. It's disgusting, but it worked.
Yeah, it did.
So I'm glad you brought that up. And it's something, definitely talk to your doctor, but if your doctor says yes, a low dose patch for a short amount of time is not going to kill you. You're not inhaling smoke. But talk to your doctor.
You're not going to develop a nicotine addiction in a week's worth, but
we're not saying go chew on coca leaves today or anything, so we're good. Not saying that, YouTube.
Right. As far as other treatments, there are a lot of docs out there that have sort of, they're doing a lot of different things. There's, what was his name? Bruce Patterson. He's an MD. But, he made popular the combination of using Maraviroc with a statin drug. Maraviroc is a drug that's used for HIV. So it's kind of one of those sort of antiviral type medications, plus the statin, which is likely being used just to decrease inflammation. And that apparently that combination that he's used has been pretty effective in some cases. I've seen Paxlovid used a little bit. That one I see is kind of hit or miss because I think it has to do with, we go back to those sort of the hypotheses of what causes long COVID. And one of those is that some people may actually still have some of the virus in them that is creating sort of chronic inflammation. It's just not to the point where it's a huge infection like the initial, acute infection. So if that's the case, Paxlovid could potentially be effective, but I've seen it not work a lot more than it has worked. So there's that. And it's not FDA approved for long COVID. It's only FDA. It just recently got FDA approved for acute COVID. So again, we're not saying go out and get that. You want to talk to your doctor about that.
You do, but this will be a whole nother episode. We could talk about FDA approval and how all that works on another episode, because that's a tricky subject in and of itself. Because a lot of the stuff that's being prescribed now for COVID 2 years ago was said that this is terrible, stupid conspiracy theory stuff that's not going to work at all. And it's just because we didn't have information. It's not that anybody was trying to lie, I don't think. I think that we just didn't have information, and now we do, but it's so freaking
Yeah.
politicized. I hate it. It's like I have
Yeah.
patients that are afraid to talk about it with me, that they may have long COVID because they aren't sure how I'm going to respond. It's like crazy.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And I get it too. Like, but there, it's not uncommon nowadays for us to use what are called orphan drugs, which are drugs that were initially sort of FDA approved for one specific thing, and they kind of set on the shelf because they were only used for that one specific thing. And now we're seeing that they can have multiple, uses, and so they get pulled off the shelf to be used for something else they weren't originally FDA approved for. So we see this, you know,
Gabapentin.
yeah. Oh, yeah, for everything. So I mean, that's not uncommon to see anymore.
Yeah, it's true. So that's really good information. Like, what do you think the takeaway is for you as far as like, we've talked a lot about long COVID, causes,
Mhm.
treatments. Like, what's the takeaway for people listening at home?
Yeah. So the main thing for me is I see a decent amount of people, and usually I see them for hormones because they've gone through this and it's gotten to a point where it's gotten so chronic that it's affecting their hormones. So guys, their testosterone levels have tanked, or other women, the women have these hormonal issues, irregular cycles, or early menopause, or something like that happens because of this. So I'm kind of getting into it from a slightly different direction, but I still see the same thing. I see people come in who are very frustrated. They're seeking answers and they're not getting any, and they feel hopeless because they think that this is their sort of lot in life, for the rest of their life, and that's not a good quality of life. So what I
Yeah.
would say kind of the takeaway is you have to understand that this can be very complicated, multifactorial. So it's going to be a lot of moving parts. You need a physician or a provider that's really just going to continue to kind of work with you, because this may take a few different iterations of treatment plans and strategies to figure out what actually sticks and what gets the needle to move the right direction. And trust me, that's frustrating from a physician's point of view as well as from a patient point of view, because not everything works. And so sometimes we have to throw a variation of the kitchen sink at you to figure out what actually sticks. Now, there's some strategies to figure out what's likely going to be effective, but at the same time, it can be really frustrating on both sides of the
Yeah.
fence there. So I'd say just encourage you, just stick with it, keep working the problem, try to stay as positive as you can through this process, because it does get frustrating.
I like that. That's good. And I think from my perspective, it's similar. Of people see acupuncture and Asian medicine as this like a drug. They see it like a drug, where it's like you try this one
Mhm.
drug and it didn't work and that's it. And they forget that it's a medical system.
Yep.
And just because a particular, prescription in that medical system doesn't work or didn't work,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean that the whole medical system isn't going to work for you. It just means that particular thing didn't. And
Mhm.
so really being tenacious and, you know, sticking with it and saying like, hey, I want to have a better quality of life, and not just giving up, but really. And by the way, I know this is hard if you're going through long COVID, because if you're having that fatigue, the last thing you want to do is push and and put
Mhm.
in all this extra effort, but just really putting in all the efforts you can to
Yep.
making sure that you give whatever you're trying, the different things you're trying, the best chance to work without just
Yep.
giving up. So
Yeah. Yeah, I have kind of two things to add to that. One is, if you're doing acupuncture, stick with it for a while. I can't tell you how many patients I've seen. I'm like, hey, have you tried acupuncture for this? And they're like, yeah, I did one or two treatments. It didn't work. I'm like, that is not enough time to figure out if acupuncture is actually going to be helpful or not. You got to stick with it for a while.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, so that's a big one. Like, just stick with it, and just like you said, be flexible. Sometimes it's going to take, you have to kind of pivot and maybe sometimes go a different direction with a treatment strategy, and that gets
yeah.
frustrating for sure.
It's true. It's like nobody is going to get a Z pack for antibiotic therapy, and they're going to be like, I tried one or two pills and it didn't work, and I just stopped taking it because it's like, well, it didn't work.
Yeah,
You take the
right.
pack.
Yep. Yep.
So
Cool, man. Well, anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, this is a really good topic. I think the main thing is if y'all have questions or there's something else that we didn't talk about you want to hear about, don't hesitate to reach out. We do this show for everybody listening. So if there's anybody who wants to hear something covered, whatever, like let us know for sure.
Yep, I agree. Well said.
drunkenmedicine@gmail.com. That's medicine with a Z.
You got it. All right, everyone. Have a great week. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you next
Thanks.
week. Take
Appreciate
care.
it, Dr. May.